Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. Lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you. I know.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And here's a special shout out to the Loving Life family and to Rudy in particular. Thanks to the family's generosity, Amelia now has a new computer and hopefully will be able to join us live and sing on Sunday night at our special 100K or 100,000 subscribers celebration. On Sunday night, we will be auctioning off the last of the big 5 paintings behind me. It is the stunning leopard. There it is. There it is. And I will be putting in a starting bid of 5,000 Rand for it. Let me show you the painting. It is just absolutely stunning. Here we go. So remember, you can put bids in tonight. Just simply type painting and the amount you want to bid, which can be any amount over 5,000 Rand. Now, just as far as where the money is going to go, I think I should disclose that to you. Okay, the first 6,000 Rand raised will go to Moira, whose bees were trashed by thugs a month ago. You might remember that video I put up. The money will be used to buy jars and get labels to sell her honey that will be ready in 2 weeks. From her profits, the 6,000 Rand will then be paid to a charity, Loving Life Supports. So it'll be like a interest-free bridging loan to get her started again. Any surplus will go to Patrick Fisher's charity in KwaZulu-Natal, where they are desperate for funds to provide food parcels to the starving. Patrick Fisher will be joining us on Sunday night. He was the channel's first hero. Tonight, I'm talking to Dan Roodt. Our focus will be on the recent riots in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng and the impact of the riots on South Africa going forward. Let me get Dan on. And while I'm doing that, please remember to subscribe to Loving Life on YouTube and on lovinglifetv.com, the platform we are transitioning to. Here we go. I'm calling Dan now. Hi, Dan.
Hi there. How are you?
Excellent. Yourself?
Fine. Yes. Thanks.
Great. Great. Wow. Turbulent time since we last spoke, isn't it?
Yes. Rather, yes.
Well, we're going to be talking about that tonight, but You know, last time we spoke, I think we spoke about the dangers of things going pear-shaped in South Africa, and now they are.
Yes. Yes, sure.
Clearly they are. Now, one of the big problems that we have in South Africa is the oligarchies, and we've clearly got two oligarchies in the ANC. You've got the Zuma.
Are we recording it or what?
Oh yes, yeah, we're live. Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah, we're absolutely live. So the problems we've got with the ANC, you've basically got two camps, haven't you? You've got two oligarchies. You've got the Zuma camp and you've got the Ramaphosa camp. Now, do you want to tell us about that, and also the comments in the Business Day that the wrong politician was funded? Do you want to speak to that as well?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the during the time of Zuma's presidency, he and the Guptas, they looted the country, and people have written books about that. But and of course that's kind of common knowledge. But the way in which Ramaphosa became one of the wealthiest people in the country is not that well known, and it seems to be almost hidden from view, and nobody in the media is actually investigating that. And what happened, during Ramaphosa's takeover of the ANC after Zuma, he was funded by various people, various businessmen, also white businessmen.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that, I saw a couple of commentaries in the Business Day recently. I've forgotten the name of the person, but he was complaining bitterly about the fact that, Ramaphosa was such a kind of an ineffectual president, and he'd received all of this financial largesse from the business community, so-called, and he was not living up to expectations. And the interesting point that this person made was that, if Zuma had been president and he'd made as many mistakes as Ramaphosa, and he, also messed up the economy to the same extent, then the business community would have long ago come out against him, and they would have forced him to some extent to make changes and so on. I mean, for example, and he mentioned, remember when for one weekend we had a finance minister who knew absolutely nothing about finance.
And the rand just tanked.
Yes. I mean, in fact, I lost a lot of money in that whole move, because I was insane enough to, I don't know,
leverage.
I had some sort of, yes, exactly. And then it went completely against me. And I lost a lot of money over that weekend. So I remember it vividly. And he was making the point that, Zuma would never have gotten away with what Ramaphosa is getting away with. So there is a sense that, he was funded by so-called business community, by a group of oligarchs in the shadows, white and black oligarchs, and now he's turning out to be such a disappointment.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we've had the biggest riots ever in South Africa. In fact, I think they must be the biggest riots probably they might even be the biggest riots in the world. I don't know. I don't know about countries like Nigeria or India or whatever, but, in recent history, I can't remember any series of riots in any country that had done as much damage as the past week has done to South Africa. In fact, over the last day or two, they've been publishing some stats in the newspaper, in the news, on the websites and so on. And, and it's absolutely astonishing because what happened was that the retail groups that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, people like ShopRite, Checkers, and Pick n Pay, and Massmart, and so on, they in order to, they are, they are obliged to tell their shareholders about the losses they've sustained over the last week or so. And so they listed some of the, the numbers of shops and outlets that were burnt to the ground or looted and so on. And it's in the hundreds.
Yeah.
Each group lost hundreds of outlets, including also distribution, these huge distribution warehouses that were attacked as well. So it's absolutely, it's the biggest bout of riots that we've ever had. And, another point that I've been making is that, remember, in the 1980s, we had about a dozen countries at least who were trying to destabilize South Africa, ranging from the Soviet Union, East Germany, Cuba, and places like that, behind the Iron Curtain, as they used to say, to the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, socialist France, when France had a socialist government, and Canada as well. So they all were done, they were all funding the ANC, giving money to them and encouraging them to commit terrorism against us and so on. And despite that, we never had the same degree of instability at the time as we've had over the last week or so. Now, imagine if a dozen quite powerful countries had to try and destabilize South Africa now. I mean, it would instantly almost lead to outright civil war.
Absolutely.
So it's been very serious, and, we've never seen this instability and havoc that we've seen over the last week or so.
Now, Dan, I want to take us back to the influence of white monopoly capital. And I better explain exactly what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about Johann Rupert, and I'm talking about Nicky Oppenheimer in particular. Johann Rupert was on a interview with the Financial Times a couple of years ago. It was November 2019. And he talked openly about how when Thabo Mbeki stepped down and Zuma stepped up, that they were talking about, the oligarchs in the financial area basically stopped Ramaphosa stepping forward as president because they wanted him first to become rich, in his words, so that he could not be bribed. And that's what he actually says. And then, of course, we know what happened under Zuma. And then Rupert goes on to say that they were very unhappy with Zuma, and he implies that they were behind Zuma's being taken down and Ramaphosa being put in his place. So clearly, even by the implication of what he's saying in this interview, it is these financial oligarchs who are basically running who runs the country. And if you look at what happened a couple of weeks ago, where the heck was Zuma? He should have, even though he was in prison, he should have released a statement saying to people, stop looting. And that would have taken away, the reason for these people who said, well, you've locked up Zuma, we're going to loot. But he kept very, very quiet, didn't he? I mean, it was almost like he was implicated in.
Yes, exactly. And of course, his children, his son and his daughter. Yes, they were stirring things up. And yes, through his silence, it seemed as if he was condoning all of this stuff. But I think the point you're making there about these billionaires or whatever in South Africa, I think they have made a huge miscalculation. And this column in the Business Day also gave me that impression that the kind of strategy was all along, okay, we're going to put these radical Afro-Marxist people or terrorist group in power in South Africa. And from the beginning, the strategy was that we're going to bribe them. We're going to feed them with money and positions and whatever. And that way we're going to keep some kind of control. And I think, there's been part of British colonialism as well. They use the term indirect rule. So you kind of appoint your group of people that you control indirectly through financial or other means or pressure or threats or whatever. And I think this was the strategy, and it just seems so completely idiotic because, it could never work. I mean, to try and control a group like the ANC, and it's, if you give them the keys to the union buildings, obviously they're going to do what they like, and they're not going to be under anyone's control. So Ramaphosa, yes, I mean, he's just been vacillating between being he's also so duplicitous, because when he talks to the wine farmers down in Stellenbosch, he tells them that, you are lovely people and we need you, and we'll never do anything to to affect your businesses or to damage your businesses. And then the very next day you would be talking to some group of blacks somewhere, and he would tell them, yes, very soon we're going to take all the land in the country and we're going to distribute all the farms to you, and so on. So there's no consistency there in anything that he's been saying. So he's not under anyone's control. He's, the whole ANC is out of control. I mean, they expect us to obey the law, but they don't obey any laws themselves. They are completely corrupt.
Yeah. Well, I'll just make 2 points about what you're just saying there. And the first one is that a month or so ago, Dan Roodt apparently, and it was reported in the papers at the time, warned the ANC if they didn't start arresting some of these corrupt leaders within the party, they would stop financing them. And that was Dan Roodt who apparently said that. The other point I'd make is that you got people like Julius Malema and actually Ramaphosa as well, who keep on throwing out the white monopoly capital situation. And what they're doing is they're basically suggesting it's a blanket right over the white population, which is clearly not the case. You've got a few families in South Africa who've got an enormous amount of wealth, and I'm talking about white families. They are the white monopoly capital, not the general white population. I think we need to clearly divide the two. It's rather like the racism word, which is so misused today when you understand what is actually behind the scenes. What do you thought about the use of that white monopoly capital and how it's actually abused?
Well, of course, that term surfaced, during the whole Bell Pottinger saga, when the Guptas were paying, this British PR company to actually launch this campaign against white South Africans in general, a kind of a campaign of racial animosity and so on. And they were talking about, and they came upon this term. I think there was a woman, what was her name? Worked for this company. Veronica. Yes. What was it? Victoria somebody.
Yeah.
And she, and they had this whole campaign going against white people in general. But yes, South Africa, to some extent, has become a banana republic because these, as you say, these wealthy families, they seem to have some political influence by spreading money around to politicians, and apparently the ANC, within the ANC itself, you become leader by bribing other people. That was how Cyril Ramaphosa, in his so-called CR17 campaign, he literally had, he paid certain regional chiefs and potentates to actually support him.
Yeah.
So he bribed them. He bought their votes during the conference, and this is now, it seems like, standard procedure in South Africa. And when you're talking about the Oppenheimers, yes, of course, at some point in the mid-80s, I think they were also the ones who legitimized the ANC by, going to Lusaka and talking to them and so on, and making clear to the previous government at the time that they considered them to be some sort of a future leadership of the country, which I think was also a major error on their part, because we've seen the catastrophic effects that the ANC have had on South Africa. And, the other thing that I was thinking, while this whole thing was happening last week, I live in one of these gated communities, and we had, we was receiving these messages from the private security service, and they were telling us, yes, we've got our eye on things, and we've got spotters and intelligence and so on, and for the moment you're okay, but we've got people on standby, and we had 24-hour surveillance and so on. It was like a war zone, and people were quite scared, and even some of these very liberal people around here, they were all rushing to the shops and stocking up, and they were filling up their their trolleys at the supermarket. I'd never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of fear and uncertainty. And a friend of mine in the US is also a columnist, Ilana Mercer. I think she spoke about this Mad Max situation in South Africa. It was, at some point, it was just complete chaos, complete lawlessness, and the looting of the shops, and the police was just standing by.
Yeah, there's
doing
big
absolutely
warehouses,
nothing.
Macro and Game.
Yes, yes.
Just shocking.
Yeah, I think there was that one. I think that one was seen probably all over the world. Just taken from a helicopter.
Yeah.
Yeah, that big warehouse down in Durban that they were looting, and there were thousands of people and hundreds of vehicles just loading up. And clearly then we were in a kind of a free-for-all. But it reminded, I've often looked at this definition of low-intensity conflict that the United States Army drew up at some point. You can actually look it up on Wikipedia. And a low-intensity conflict is defined as a political military confrontation between contending states or groups below conventional war and above the routine peaceful competition among states. It frequently involves protracted struggles of competing principles and ideologies. Low-intensity conflict ranges from subversion to the use of the armed forces. It is waged by a combination of means employing political, economic, informational, and military instruments. Now, if you look back over the years, say going back to the 1960s and even early on, even to the 19th century, we've had a lot of conflict in South Africa between groups, and in the 20th century we had some sort of a balance of power and stability, but then we were again destabilized from outside, and now this whole conflict is just continuing, and the ANC hasn't really made peace with the minority white population in this country. They see state power as a means to actually continue their war against us, and they are using the legal system and parliament to actually hurt us and to discriminate against us and to undermine us, to subvert us, and this is what's going on. And this kind of outburst that we saw was only one in a long series of events like that is part of this generalized conflict in South Africa. And the people, these white monopoly capital people and a lot of the political parties, they are just too stupid to see the situation for what it is.
Yeah.
And the kind of this kind of looting that we saw. I mean, the Ilana Mercer talking about the Mad Max situation in South Africa. In fact, that's part of our everyday life. People get robbed and killed all the time. It's happening all the time. It's just not on the same scale and with the same intensity that we saw last week, but it's happening all the time. And the question is, when is it going to stop? And how are we going to get out of this situation?
Well, I have to say, Dan, that when I look at the way the ANC operate, it's almost like they cut off their nose the whole time to spite their face. They just cannot see beyond the idiocy of their actions. Now, you were just talking there about the looting, etc., etc. Clearly, what happened in KwaZulu-Natal in particular were the biggest riots ever in South Africa. How do they compare to the size of riots seen elsewhere around the world?
Well, I think now the death toll is already at around 250 people. And if you look at, some of the biggest riots that they've had in the USA, for example, the 1967 riots in Detroit, I think fewer than 100 people died there. And then in 1992 in Los Angeles, we had those Rodney King riots, also around 100 people killed. And in each of those instances, you're talking about, and shops were also looted. There was the infamous confrontation between the Korean shop owners and rioting black people in Los Angeles. But despite that, you're talking about damage in maybe the tens of millions of dollars or the hundreds of millions of dollars. Whereas here, South Africa is sustained in the billions of dollars, of US dollars worth of damage in a few days. They're talking about between 50 and 100 billion rand. And, we're quite fortunate in that as a result of the past riots that we had, especially the 76 riots, that were not on the same scale as these riots either. I mean, the 76 riots were fairly tame compared to these, but back then the media were immediately ready to accuse the government at the time of having caused the riots. Whereas now, of course, nobody's blaming the ANC for the riots. It's just seen as something spontaneous that's happened because there's too much inequality or unemployment or whatever. But it's been this kind of damage is on a scale for the size of our economy and the infrastructure that we've got. It's huge. It's the biggest riots that we've ever seen in the country, and one of the biggest series of riots in the world, surpassing anything that's ever happened in the United States, which is also a country that is prone to violence like this. And I've read a lot about Detroit, and I'm quite concerned that we might see a kind of a Detroit effect in South Africa, in that after a big riot like that, public confidence and the consumer business confidence takes such a huge knock that people just tend to avoid a place like that. And Detroit used to be one of the richest cities in the United States, the citadel of the motor industry, and it actually bled to death after 67. And today it's almost like a ghost town, and it's just one big huge slum. And the risk is that South Africa from here onwards, as a result of these riots, might also be on a downward slope from which we may never recover if we don't get the leadership to actually pick things up and to sort out the problems. But nobody has got the courage for that. And it's just more of the same, and that this empty rhetoric and
Now,
you know,
Dan,
about the rainbow nation, and we standing together. I mean, we've just had ethnic conflict, a real ethnic conflict down in Durban, where Indians and Zulus were actually at each other's throats, and even now on Twitter and so on, it's still going on. You know, there's this hashtag Phoenix Massacre and so on. And then instead of analyzing that and trying to solve those problems, you know, people are coming up with this notion, we're standing together now and we are healing as a country and so on. All this empty rhetoric that we've had for years to just paper over the problems.
Yeah. Now, Dan, I want to just pick up on something which I really think has been overlooked by the mainstream media in South Africa in particular. And that is, if you look at the ministers of defense and the minister of police, Bekesele, there's only one common thing that they have, and that is their highest education is a teacher's diploma. Now, how can you have ministers who are heading up really the most critical arms of government when it comes to something like the riots, who obviously don't have much intelligence? Because if that's the highest they can actually achieve, a teacher's diploma, which equates to being allowed to teach primary school children, not junior or high school children, which means that their education level is very, very ordinary. And yet here they are expected to run a slick police service, a slick army. You just have to look what's happened to the police service under Bekesele. You just have to look at what's happened to the SANDF under not only the current minister, but previous ministers. It's a complete and utter disgrace. And just to cap it all, a lot of the people who were looting were actually police. You know, you've got a completely chaotic situation of the people who are supposed to be taking the law back into control when something like this happens. So they clearly don't have an idea, and that's why they were completely missing in action when the looting started. What are your thoughts about the impact of having a really third-rate police service and a pretty well non-existent army on what happened over the last couple of weeks?
Well, yes, you know, both the police service and the army have been downgraded over many, many years. And, you know, one of the first things that happened after 1994 was that they fired all the experienced career policemen that had been trained under the old system and gone to the police college and served their lives in the force and so on. And they had the legal background for it as well. They got rid of all those people, and they actually, these kind of lackadaisical terrorists that they had in the camps in Angola and Zambia and places like Tanzania and places like that, who gave themselves ranks, they put them into the police service. And the entire police service was I mean, the ANC's terrorist army used to be called Umkhonto weSizwe, the Spear of the Nation.
Well, they still got the veterans side of that.
Yes, exactly. But that has also now been disbanded because, you know, these
Zuma
people are part of the Zuma faction, so now they're no longer popular. But these so-called MK commanders, they were all given high ranks in the police. And that also, then the police became corrupt as a result. And, you know, in some instances, there was a very vague line between organized crime and the police themselves, and especially in the intelligence service. I mean, the police intelligence service is apparently a complete disaster. I've spoken to people who had inside information about what was going on there, and
Are we talking about iPad?
Because of course the iPad thing was supposedly to control these people, but
yes.
But because they were dealing with secret funds and so on, apparently they just stole most of that money. And of course, under Zuma, the National Intelligence Service was also used to further, to their own internecine conflicts and so on within the party. So it's a complete disaster. So I think somebody made the comment that either the police didn't have any notion of what was going on in Natal. They had no intelligence whatsoever, or they had some intelligence and they did nothing. And in either case, it was completely shocking. And in fact, that was, I think, Johan Boysen. He was a previous police chief in Natal, who also went through some, and he exposed some corruption and so on. And as a result of that, they turned against him, and he was for years involved in court cases and so on, trying to prove his innocence, which he eventually did. But yes, so the police is just generally in South Africa a complete joke, because ultimately last week it was up to the members of the public and the private security forces to actually try and maintain some semblance of order. And as Becky Cele himself has said on several occasions, the private security personnel do not have the legal powers to actually do police work. They are not allowed to arrest somebody. They're not allowed to, to act as police men or women. So, I mean, they can only really guard places, which they're doing all the time. We've got 750,000 private security guards in South Africa trying to guard, people's assets in this country that are being looted constantly in this kind of Mad Max situation that we're living in as a result of being ruled by, a bunch of buffoons who, at the end of the Cold War, instead of, disappearing with the rest of the communist parties all over the world, they were given, the only industrialized state in Africa to govern. That is the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah. And I always say that where they're taking South Africa is back to pre-1652. I mean, it's really, that's the way it's moving. Now, what do you think the cause of the riots were, Dan?
Well, Malema has even said it, and it's the ultimate cause of the riots. I mean, the thing that triggered it was the factional strife within the party itself, within the ruling party, between the Zuma faction and the Ramaphosa faction. And that came to a head, with Zuma's imprisonment for contempt of court, because the courts also, I mean, even apart from the fact that probably Zuma is guilty of corruption during the arms deal, but it seems to me that the courts are also taking the side. I mean, the courts are also partisan in that, nothing. I mean, Ramaphosa has also been charged with, all the bribes that he took during his campaign.
Right.
But the courts are very lenient on old Ramaphosa, and they take his word for everything, whereas they come down very hard on Zuma. So it's obvious that the courts are also biased in this whole clash between Zuma and Ramaphosa. But that was the trigger for the thing. But I think that ultimately, yes, the reason why it ran into complete mayhem was Yes, because of the fact that the police service has been, you know,
Trashed.
over years, it's been neglected and mismanaged. That was probably the root cause of it, because under the old police force, something like this would never have happened. I mean, they would have taken the thing in hand within the first day or two.
Right.
And they would never have allowed it to run completely out of control as it did.
Yeah, you can understand why in the townships often you hear of mob justice, because people are just so sick and tired of the police doing nothing and the justice system doing nothing. Now, I want to just expand a bit on the causes of the riot.
But
Now,
you know, I also wrote a piece in the German newspaper or for their website for Junge Freiheit
right,
over the past week, and we are also referred to this mob violence, because the mob violence in South Africa and in Africa generally, it's used as a political tool by politicians, and the ANC also used it to come to power in South Africa. They
That's
used
right.
mob violence in the early 90s in order to get into power and in order to intimidate the old de Klerk government, who completely capitulated as a result of this mob violence. So mob violence is something that's quite common in Africa, and especially in South Africa. So that was also one of the reasons why we saw these riots, is because the politicians are always using mob violence and trying to stir it up in order to further their their quest for power.
Right. Now, I just wanted to put in a sort of a related question there regarding the causes. Why haven't the instigators been arrested yet? Now, they've just brought out a law which says if you say something that instigates violence in South Africa, that's a crime. Now, clearly, Zuma's daughter and Zuma's son did exactly that. Why are they not behind bars right now? Just as an example of what I'm talking about.
Well, you know, if everybody who instigates violence in South Africa had to be imprisoned, I mean, you know, hundreds of thousands of people would have to be imprisoned, because you can see these sort of radical comments all the time. And even somebody like Mbeki, when he was president, he also made certain threats and so on. And he said that, you know, if you don't hand over your stuff now, there's going to be an uprising and a revolution and so on. He was also making threats like that towards.
But this is Zuma's kids.
Yes.
This is not.
Yeah,
this
sure.
is not John Ndlovu in Soweto. This is Zuma's kids. And when they said that, their comments went viral right through the whole of South Africa.
Yes, true.
So that's
yes,
very different.
I think they could be charged with inciting public violence. Well, probably because, you know, within the current political setup, you know, that will cause even more
so there's no justice,
conflict.
is what we're saying.
No, within the ruling party. Yes, and you can contrast that with the way people are persecuted for all these so-called transgressions. Exactly. Crimen injuria and transgressions of racial etiquette and so on. You know, if some white person uses the K word somewhere, you know, then they will.
It's national news.
It's national news, and not only that, but the entire criminal justice system will go after that person.
Goes meltdown, yeah.
Now, exactly. Whereas in this case, where a few individuals have contributed to this huge collapse in law and order in South Africa, and riots, and costing us billions of dollars, yes, nothing is happening.
Well, they did arrest one man, I believe, who was the leader of the Patriotic Alliance in the West Rand, and he put out that voice note, and you know, they grabbed him at 2:00 in the morning for inciting public violence. I mean, it was just, I thought that was quite extraordinary, because I heard two tapes, one from a clearly a Zulu person, which he was speaking very broken English, saying that they were going to be doing exactly what the second person warned people in Roodepoort and Krugersdorp about, and he was the one they went after. They never went after the initiator who put the first audio tape
Yes.
out.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think he's just an easy target, and he's somebody they can kind of make an example of without it having any real political effect, or unlike, for example, Zuma's family. They wouldn't go after Zuma's family because that might cause some more riots somewhere.
Now, here's an interesting thing. Quite clearly, the Zulu royal family and leadership are horrified by what happened during the rioting period. They've actually, one of their MP captains actually came out, and he had a very sort of informal interview with someone where he said, we need to work as a Zulu kingdom leadership with the white community so that we can sort out this problem. And he actually said this in that interview. I don't know if you've heard it, but he was dressed up in all his regalia. And yeah, please, over to you.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't actually seen that, but at one point in the recent past, say going back a few decades, the Zulus have been something of a conservative force in South African politics. Yeah. I mean, especially when in the 1980s, when Inkatha was quite a large and powerful movement. But the left specifically targeted them, and especially and then they terrorized the Zulus as well, and they destabilized Natal at the time. So I see these sort of comments by the Zulu royal family as sort of harking back to that period when Zulus were more in the sort of traditional camp. But yes, I'm also we mentioned a place like Detroit. I think Natal has sustained enormous damage. KwaZulu-Natal has sustained enormous damage in these riots because somebody was I saw somewhere that people seem to think that only the major cities like Durban and Pietermaritzburg were damaged in the riots, but in fact most of the small towns in KZN have also been devastated and looted and destroyed and burned down. So it's like a war zone. It's almost the aftermath of a civil war that we saw there. So who's going to repair all of that? The ANC has already looted the state coffers. So the 500 billion rand was spent on the so-called COVID response. We don't know on what. All that money has just disappeared. They also got a World Bank loan or an IMF loan of several, almost 100 billion rand. All of that money has also just disappeared. So where's the money to rebuild the KwaZulu-Natal province after these riots? And I suspect people are just going to leave. A lot of people are going to leave that province.
And I think one of the factors we haven't even looked at is how insurance premiums are going to go through the roof because they're going to have to recover billions.
You see, but this is now where this whole I was going to mention just now this whole this public insurance. No, but we've got a special insurance. State-funded. It's not exactly state-funded, but it's a kind of a state-controlled insurance facility called Sasria. And after the 76 riots, the old government, decided that the insurance companies had these exclusion clauses in their policies, whereby any form of political rioting or terrorism were excluded.
Yeah.
So they brought in this Sasria, so-called special risk insurance. And a small portion of all, short-term insurance in South Africa is set aside for this kind of risk. And that should have protected all of these businesses from the damages that they've suffered. And most of them are going to claim under the SASRIA facility, but apparently they're not going to have enough money to cover all these damages. So then ultimately the taxpayer is going to have to make good on the shortfall in the facility of SASRIA to protect or to cover these businesses. So yes, I mean it's financially it has been an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
For South Africa.
Now we talked just a few minutes ago about the factions within the ANC. One of the comments I picked up was that the reason why Ramaphosa has been loath to set up a state of emergency is because if he did that, the leader of COPTA, Dlamini Zuma, would then be heading up the actual state of emergency, which would take the power away from Ramaphosa. Is that true, or is that not true? The fact that if he sets up a state of emergency, then he actually is no longer in charge. This ex-wife of Jacob Zuma is then in charge of South Africa.
Yes, I've also seen something like that. It's quite possible. I haven't gone into all the details, the constitutional complexities of a state of emergency, but it's quite possible that the pendulum of power would then swing back to Zuma, and probably that is why he avoided, a state of emergency. In the mid-1980s, when we had even smaller riots than this, then P.W. Botha announced a state of emergency, at least in certain magisterial districts, which could have been done in this case, just to stabilize things. But, lacking the police and military capacity to actually contain things here, it probably wouldn't have served much of a purpose.
Yeah. Now, just on that very point you made, the incompetence of the police service and the army, don't you think that will embolden people in the future when it comes to looting and rioting? Because right now in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, I know that there are a lot of people who are starving as a result of what's gone on in the last couple of weeks. Now that they know that there's effectively no police service, no law and order in KwaZulu-Natal, isn't that like a signal for them to say, okay, we can just go and loot and go and grab food from other people?
Yes, exactly. I think you're quite right. Even on the kind of in the postmodern leftist theory, by people like Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze and so on, they've always maintained that any form of disciplinary order is dependent upon the obedience of the people serving under such an order. So it's not only the capacity of the state to be able to contain violence and so on. It's also the obedience, and the natural kind of law-abiding behavior of the population that ensures law and order. So in this case, we've seen, as you say, we've crossed a line. I think we've crossed a line now, and a lot of those mobs and gangs and looters, they've become conscious of the fact that they can actually do this without being stopped. And so there is a huge risk that we are going to see a repetition of this type of incident. And heaven knows where that might lead, because then we could be in a permanent state of riot, and they would actually continue looting until nothing works anymore.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say when we talk about looting, for those people who don't live in South Africa, we've got about 600 people watching at the moment. When we talk about looting in South Africa over the last couple of weeks, most of the people who were looting were driving fancy cars or trucks where they could put fridges and stuff like that on. It wasn't because they were hungry. They were looting because they had an opportunity to steal. That's got to be very clearly set out. Is there something you'd like to say about that, Dan?
Yes, I think, it goes back to what I was saying earlier on about this kind of Mad Max situation in South Africa that we've had since 1994, and where you have a lot of opportunistic criminals who are watching, and they're standing around, and if you stop at a traffic light, they would throw a stone through your window and then grab whatever they can. We've all been victim of such crimes. I mean, I myself, a couple of weeks ago, I went to the court in Pretoria, and then they stole my laptop computer out of the boot of my car. And I don't know exactly how they did it, but they've got these people standing around and watching you and so on. So we are, every day, on a daily basis, we are exposed to this kind of opportunistic looting and theft and criminality, and especially women alone in cars. They would try and attack them and smash the window. That's why, it's almost standard if you buy a car in South Africa to put so-called smash and grab film on your windows, so it doesn't break that easily.
Right.
So it can withstand some stone or whatever without actually making a hole in the window for them to get into your car and grab your handbag or your laptop or whatever. So yes, I mean that opportunistic crime exists everywhere, and this just and as soon as an opportunity like that arises, where obviously the police are overwhelmed, the private security guards guarding these shopping centers or the distribution warehouses are overwhelmed, then the looting will come to the fore.
Yeah. Now, one of the issues that keeps on being raised is that this was actually because of inequality and racism in South Africa by the minority whites and all these sort of things that the mainstream media in South Africa come up with. Now, what I've noticed just here through my channel and speaking to people is that the ethnic clashes in Durban between, for example, the Indians and the Zulus, and I think the Indians were far more assertive when it came to pushing back against the looters. What it's actually done is it's brought far closer the minority white community and the Indians as a combined force of people who will fight back against looting. But not only that, there's a large percentage of the African community who also feel that what went on was totally unacceptable. And it was so great to see when they were defending shops in parts of KwaZulu-Natal when the rioters came around, or the looters came around. It was all races there standing in a line defending those shops. And you've got this sort of it's like a disconnect between a group of people who just want to loot and pillage, and then you've got a group of people who are saying, not on my watch. Now, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, you think, you see, the history books, recently written about South Africa are all false, because the leftist narrative has always been that, you had this tiny group of racist whites in South Africa who governed a large non-white population and oppressed them. Whereas, even I don't have a very high regard for him at all, but there was a liberal politician called Frederick von Sales-Slobbert, and he stated at one point that under so-called apartheid, or under the old system, up to 60% of the total population cooperated in maintaining this system, and they were all, they all had some role to play within that system. So I think that there is a kind of a divide in South Africa between your more traditional kind of person, or the more community-oriented type of person with certain traditional values or communal values, family values, and so on, and this kind of anomic, radical, criminal population. And the ANC and criminality go hand in hand. The ANC, they've been always been a partly criminal organization. I mean, they even committed armed robberies and stuff like that. So, and I think you can see that divide still in the country, and a lot of people long for and hanker after a kind of a more peaceful life with law and order and predictability and stability. Whereas on the other hand, you've got these leftists, revolutionaries, who are stoking the flames of hatred and racial division all the time, on the radio stations and in the press, in the media, also in the mainstream media. And they are the people who then say, the only thing that's going to save us is equality. And in order to attain that level of equality, they want some sort of a Soviet-style revolution, or Maoist kind of cultural revolution, where everybody will lose their assets and we'll all end up on collective farms, I don't know, working under the armed guard of some communist commissar. That's a sort of vision for equality in South Africa, that everything must change, and we must first destroy the current system, Dan, in order to move to a new utopia.
That's very interesting you say that, because that's exactly what Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum is suggesting is their objective, where he says by 2030, you will own nothing, but you will be happy. I'm sure you've heard that infamous statement by Klaus Schwab.
Yes, I have heard that.
Now, don't you think South Africa might be the canary in the cage? That, they're actually pushing for that to happen in a huge country like South Africa?
Well, a lot of people have commented on the fact that we are a kind of a guinea pig. We had this regime change where we were put under this radical communist, quasi-communist, socialist government, and they are trying to create this kind of multicultural utopia in South Africa. And yes, and the government wants to take our assets. That's for sure. They want to, and they want to remove so-called centuries of inequality, and everybody must be the same. Must probably own nothing, because they're arguing a lot of, especially in the EFF, people are arguing that nobody should own any land whatsoever. So they're just going to scrap the deeds register, and the state will control all land, and some politician or commissar will give you permission to farm on such a portion of land, or to build a house there, but you will own nothing yourself. You will just be landless.
And if you're not productive, you will just be discarded.
Yes.
So elderly people will basically have a timestamp. Now, there's a very interesting comment by Gareth van Onselen in Business Day, where he commented, South Africa has been condemned to democracy. Do you want to just explain what that's all about?
I sort of coined that phrase that we condemned to democracy, but he was basically saying the same thing, that we now have the so-called democracy, but it's meaningless. I think he used the term meaningless. It's completely meaningless because it cannot lead to a change in government. The ANC might as well be a dictatorship or a kind of an oligarchy governing forever, because democracy cannot deliver a change in government. So it's all of this charade of elections and campaigning and so on. It's all just redundant, because
it's like the emperor with no clothes.
Yeah, it's not going to lead to any change in the current situation.
Yeah.
Yes, and South Africa, unfortunately, these radical leftist people, they've just got too much influence here in the media and in government, and at the universities as well. So they exercise a lot of power and influence, and also for that reason, we won't see any form of political change in South Africa. So we are really then condemned to their version of democracy, which is the left in power forever, and the radical Afro-Marxist left in power forever.
Yeah, well, the mainstream media in South Africa are a complete and utter disgrace. I mean, they're controlled by...
I mean, my only hope is that a lot of these people, because of all the damage they've done, that a lot of them will actually start emigrating, because, I think it's happened in other countries that some of these leftists would actually destroy the country, and then afterwards they would say, oh, well, now I can no longer live in South Africa because you can't buy food, or there's shortages of electricity and water and petrol, so I'd rather go and live in Australia. So I'm hoping, because they're not patriotic South Africans at all. They are kind of globalists or internationalists, and whether they live in South Africa or Canada or Australia or the UK, it doesn't matter to them, and that makes them probably more mobile than people who are more committed to this country. So let's hope that a lot of them will actually leave and maybe go to Canada or some place like that, because I think Justin Trudeau's kind of style of government and his ideas and principles would suit them a lot better. And maybe
just don't
Canada.
Send them to Australia.
No, yeah.
But talking about these guys and them emigrating, you got people like Nathan Kirsch, who is a multi-billionaire, who owns, I think it's Perscore, which is one of the major media outlets in South Africa. I'm not sure if I got the name right, but it's something like that. And he's the guy who's called the publisher. He's not in South Africa, he's overseas. He's calling the shots as to what should be written in South Africa. So they don't have to be in South Africa. Some of them are already outside the country causing shit.
Yeah, and of course you've got somebody like George Soros as well.
Open Society.
His Open Society Foundation here in South Africa, and he's donating quite a lot of money to them, and a lot of the media people also fall under his control and his influence. So they don't have to be, as you say, they don't have to be here. Even from the ANC, for most of its life, it was actually a foreign movement, kind of a foreign cabal spread between London, some East European countries, and Moscow, and even Odessa, which at the time, obviously was part of the Soviet Union. So yes, but at least if they are outside the country, then at least maybe we can do something to stop them from manipulating us inside the country. And some of the some of the laws that the old government made, for example, they had a law against affected organizations. So an affected organization would be an organization that's completely funded from overseas. And I think Putin has made a similar law in Russia to kind of counter some of these American NGOs that are trying to destabilize Russia, like George Soros and others, like the Open Society Foundation. So he made a law saying that, if it's fine if you're an NGO in Russia and you've got support from Russians and they donate to your cause, but you're not allowed to get the majority of your funding from overseas and be sort of a conduit for foreign powers to destabilize the country. And that was exactly the kind of law that we had at the time. And that gave us some protection from these people, except that then they devised secret ways. It was actually money laundering that they used to actually fund some of the revolutionaries inside South Africa. But I think now with the money laundering laws in the world, it will be a lot more difficult for them to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the guy who headed up the Brexit party, I just can't think of his name right now, but the guy in the UK, fantastic speaker. He was actually a member of the European Union.
Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage, that's the guy, Nigel Farage. And he made a speech in the European Union where he said, all of you guys have been bought by Open Society Foundation. And he actually named the people and he said, this is how much money you've got, because they had to show donations. And basically all the unelected bureaucrats in Denmark, who are basically running the European Union, have a huge financial debt to George Soros and the Open Society Foundation. And we look at the chaos that's happening in the European Union with all these illegal migrants just being allowed to stay. It's totally devastating, that part of the world.
Yeah, sure. That's exactly the type of process that occurs. Yeah, when you destabilize a country from outside, the so-called color revolutions, and we had a kind of one of the first color revolutions in this country when the ANC was installed in power. Although they also used, of course, some very hardcore terrorism to actually destabilize South Africa and to sap people's morale. It was sort of out of the kind of the North Vietnamese handbook that they studied, apparently, on how to actually you terrorize also your own people in order to get them to support you, because then they become scared of you and then they won't go against you. And then they will eventually follow you. It's a sort of a Stockholm syndrome, that you eventually you support the people you are afraid of and that are a threat to you. And this is the sort of basis on which the ANC gained power in South Africa.
Yeah, not just talking about the ANC. At the very start of this live stream, I talked about the ANC are rather like the old saying, if you cut off your nose to spite your face. And we've been talking about migration of the radicals from South Africa. I think the great tragedy is that what happened in the last couple of weeks was the final straw for a lot of people who can afford to leave South Africa, that South Africa needs for its tax base and for the actual brain tank that they offer. And I'm including professionals like doctors, top business people who are going to say, hey, we've had enough of this, we're leaving South Africa. And it's just going to make it that much harder for the country to pull itself out of the hole.
Yes, that's probably true. And I think a country like Australia or even New Zealand, they've been attracting a lot of our best people, the best qualified people, and the people with enough money to emigrate over many, many years. And that has definitely weakened us, and it has led to a brain drain, as you say, and also capital flight from South Africa. So yes, it's kind of a potential death spiral that we find ourselves in if something isn't done to turn things around. And if we can't find also some maybe outside help to do that, because Smuts, previous Prime Minister of South Africa, he once said that the future of South Africa will always be determined outside its own borders, and to some extent that truism has held, because the ANC only came to power because they had the support of foreign countries, especially the Scandinavian countries, Sweden specifically. I mean, they funded them. They even organized their election for them in 1994.
No.
That was something that I only realized a few months ago when I was reading up on this. I mean, it's not known to people in South Africa, but Sweden sent a whole contingent of people here to organize the ANC's election for them, because obviously, I mean, they were completely clueless when it came to actual democratic electioneering and so on. I mean, they were just kind of a surrogate Marxist terrorist group, controlled by East Europeans mostly. So what on earth did they actually know about elections?
Yeah.
But lo and behold, Sweden provided the money and the know-how to actually get them into power through the ballot box.
Yeah.
First you soften up people with terrorism, and then you come, with the ballot box. So that's the way they got into power.
Right. Now, I'm going to start putting questions I received from the side chat to you. So, guys, we've got about 600 people watching at the moment. If you put your questions in the side chat, I will put those to Dan. And Bruce Basters has asked, Ramaphosa was vice president while Zuma was looting. Surely he must have known.
Yes, definitely. I think he was in on the whole thing. All of them were. And I think, I don't know who it was, recently said that it's the ANC's right also to do business with government and their own families and so on. It's part of black economic empowerment that, your family members can have contracts with government and so on. And all of them have been doing that. And, Ramaphosa must definitely have known about the arms deal and everything that was going on. In fact, we mentioned Sweden, and Ramaphosa was sent to Sweden in the 1970s. And he was then sort of trained up there as a trade unionist, and he was taken all over the country. And they also funded him at the time. So and Sweden was also involved in the arms deal. They sold us the Gripens that apparently don't fly much in South Africa. If you go to any other country, like in Europe, in France, or whatever, every now and again you would see a military plane exercising in the air. We'd see them flying fighters and so on. Whereas in South Africa, it almost never happens that any Gripen would be in the air. So, but we paid billions and billions to Sweden for these Gripen planes. And so, yes, who knows? I mean, what Ramaphosa's role was in all of that. And he suddenly became extremely wealthy, even shortly after the Mandela era.
Yeah, that's incredible.
How did that happen? How do you, without any capital as a kind of a trade union organizer, you become a billionaire overnight? How does that happen?
Yeah, it's Triple B, Double E played a major role in that, but that's another story. Now, Daniel van der Westhuizen has asked, Paul Holden Shadow World Investigations laid out this Sinjin distribution account where the monies were transferred to Hong Kong for Al-Qaeda. Who is following up on that? Now, that's totally unrelated to South Africa. So if you don't have it, we'll leave. I think we'll leave that one alone.
I don't know too much about Al-Qaeda and funding of Al-Qaeda.
Fiona Timms has asked, Does Dan think the rioting and looting will escalate? We and the prisoners let out of jail have not seen any punishment for those who've been caught.
Yes, well, apparently, they have arrested a few people, but we haven't seen much in terms of people being tried in court and being sentenced for that. So, unfortunately, I think it's up to the private security people now to protect the shops and the supermarkets and the shopping centers. And they probably have some contingency plans now for that. So I think, and that's also something else that I'm seeing in South Africa, is that the state will eventually just become weaker and weaker, and the private sector will have to step into that space, and they will have to provide a lot of the security. They already do, but I think it's going to have to go further than what they are doing at the moment. And they probably realize themselves that they will have to do that. It's almost going to be an automatic process that a lot of these business groups and listed companies will start protecting their own assets by employing, more security people, or having, say, a different kind of security trained individual, having more rapid, what do you call it, sort of armed response. I mean, we've got armed response at the moment, but I think you're going to see a lot more of these armed response people who are able then to, at a moment's notice, protect some shopping center or distribution center or something like that. I know from speaking to some of the people in our area that apparently they do have some capacity for that. I mean, during last week, one of the security companies had a couple of helicopters in the air most of the time, watching what was going on. So I think they're going to start using drones, and they will have intelligence on the ground as well. The police doesn't have the intelligence, but the private sector people will start getting intelligence on the ground, knowing when there's a potential flashpoint developing or potential looting developing, and they will have the capacity probably to stop it.
Yeah, well, clearly the social media, WhatsApp and things like that, have been used by these groups of looters. Now,
yes, definitely. I think that is it's almost, I think there is an aspect of a flash mob as well, that they have the communication then to say, okay, well, we're going after that shopping center now, and then
I think this
hundreds or even thousands would suddenly arrive.
And I think this is a very interesting point, Dan, and it points to, if you look at that macro warehouse that was looted with the aerial footage and the helicopter, just about every looter had a vehicle. So we're not talking about the poor Africans in the townships. We're talking about the middle class ANC cadres who've, struck it rich. They're probably in the Zuma faction of the ANC. And this was a perfect opportunity, using something like WhatsApp, which most Africans in the townships would not have access to. So it was almost like
I think everybody, probably everybody has WhatsApp, and it's I think that South Africa was one of the countries where mobile phones was adopted probably more quickly than in many other places. And, that's why I think there are more cell phones now than there are people in South Africa. So just about everybody has WhatsApp. So whether they're poor or rich or whatever, they've got the means to communicate. But as you rightly say, a lot of them had vehicles, and they were more or less organized. So they weren't poor, definitely not.
They weren't starving.
Exactly. So this kind of leftist argument, that it's the poor, hungry masses who are rising up, and no, that's not true at all. The people who were looting, they were opportunistic criminals and people who were probably involved in other forms of corruption as well. I mean, they were already looting in other areas, probably illegal looting through BEE and so on, because BEE is just a form of looting the value of shareholders in companies, because you're getting something for nothing.
Yeah,
and and somebody has to pay for it.
Well, it's interesting because there are a couple of comments I'd make about that. I believe the way that someone like Ramaphosa actually acquires, let's say, 51% of Lonrho, is that the company actually takes out a loan and provides the money for him to buy the shares, and the interest on the loan is then paid for by the company out of their profits. So basically, the black beneficiary acquires the shares, and as the company hopefully grows, his assets grow despite him not putting 1 cent in towards the actual acquisition of those shares. I believe that's how it works. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes. That is the way it works. And even in cases where the shares of the company would go down afterwards for some reason, say if there's a sort of a protracted slump on the stock exchange, they would actually bail him out and
well, they need
to
survive.
Create a new scheme. Yes,
they need to survive. If they don't have that 51% shareholding, then they can't trade.
But when we were talking about the brain drain previously, and you also mentioned taxes, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see what effect these riots are going to have on the tax income in South Africa, because this new tax chief, Kieswetter, he is very confident that he's going to, through stricter policing of the taxation system and, through technology, and they're going to watch people's bank accounts here and overseas and so on, that they are going to get more taxes from us. But I doubt, this thing has hit the income of these companies. They're going to pay less tax. A lot of people are going to be unemployed. They're not going to pay as-you-earn tax anymore. So I think, the government's income is also going to be largely affected by these riots. And also the tax patriotism is already at a very low point, and it's going to go down even further, because why should we support this corrupt government who's doing absolutely nothing for us? And I mean, one of the very basic functions of government is to protect the lives and property of the citizens, and they're not doing that. So why should they get any money from us whatsoever?
I was just going to say to you that companies like, let's say, Pick n Pay, having to bring in large security forces to protect their own business, is going to have a huge impost on the cost of food. It's going to go up through the roof, and other goods that they sell, because they've got to still make profits. So what's going to happen now is that the price of everything in South Africa is going to skyrocket. And despite that fact, the police who should be doing that role, who are being paid by the taxpayers, are just so incompetent now within South Africa that they might as well not have a police force. And you've got a growing amount of taxation that's been actually burdened onto people who go to the shops, because the GST has gone up, the petrol price has gone up as a result of new taxes on petrol. So the government is actually gouging from people who buy anything and everything in South Africa, while providing less and less support for the people who are actually paying the taxes. Where's this going to end? Because as the tax base becomes totally damaged, and the government can't pay back its debts, surely South Africa is going to land up like Zimbabwe.
Yes, you're probably right there. I've often thought, in English there's this word, an extra. Um, if you're making a movie, then you've got a lot of people standing around as extras.
Yeah.
And in Afrikaans, we use the word figurant, which comes from the French figurant. And it's almost like the police are just extras. They're just standing around in uniform, looking like policemen.
Yeah.
To be photographed or something like that. But they're not real policemen because they're not doing their jobs. And a lot of the people working for the government are also extras because, they've got long holidays and they're off sick most of the time, or they don't even come to work, but they still get a salary. And sometimes when sometimes when they get caught out and they've had their fingers in the till, or they've been involved in corruption and so on, then there's an investigation and a disciplinary process which can go on for years. And in the meantime, while sitting at home, they still get a salary. So, I mean, they are just completely useless, and they are just a cost to all of us.
Yeah.
So, yes, you're quite right. And the impact on inflation is going to be there. But the strange thing, although today the rand weakened somewhat, today and yesterday, but I was actually watching the rand from last Monday onwards, and on the first day it sort of weakened quite a bit, and then say 2-3%, and then after that it strengthened all through the riots. Wow. Until yesterday, and then now it's gone back up to sort of slightly above the same levels as on the first Monday of the riots. But the thing is that South Africa, we are a commodity exporter. So there's this constant flow of, export dollars, foreign exchange into our economy. So, and the weaker the domestic economy gets, the more, the fewer imports we have, while the exports stay the same. So I don't think we're going to see the same kind of hyperinflation that we saw in Zimbabwe. But there's definitely going to be some form of food inflation. We're already seeing that. And the economy is just going to be in the doldrums for years as a result of all this mismanagement that we're seeing from the ANC regime, unfortunately. But there won't be maybe a sort of thousands of trillions of percent of inflation like we've seen in Zimbabwe, as long as the mines keep going and all the commodity exports still flow.
But for that, they need electricity, and if Eskom goes down,
yes, sure,
a Red Rover.
Yes.
No, look,
true, but there are plans afoot, to also go on to solar and all that sort of thing. So, that's why I think South Africa, I mean, there are a couple of scenarios, maybe that's a whole different discussion, but one of the scenarios I see is that we're going to have the private sector, it's almost going to become a kind of a new oligarchy of, you're talking about these business people, the billionaires.
Yes.
And they might dispense with these politicians altogether and just rule the country themselves. And the politicians, like the police, will be extras in their whole theater.
Yeah.
They will just be standing around and sort of making speeches, but they won't have any power or influence, and it wouldn't really matter what they do, because a couple of rich people will be running the country. And they will provide the security and the electricity and everything. A lot of these big businesses are chomping at the bit to actually produce their own electricity. I mean, Sasol has already got their own power plant there at Secunda. So, and a lot of them, some of the mines also have their own electricity production, and they've just had the law changed so that they can have bigger plants. So I think that's going to become more and more common.
Now, Johan Rupert's got a hydroelectric plant on his farm, and his big gripe is that the excess electricity he cannot churn back into the grid in South Africa because of regulations. But I just want to move on to just say to everybody watching, we've still got well over 500 people watching right now. Thank you for joining us tonight. We'll be wrapping up the live stream shortly. Please remember to register on our new platform, which is called lovinglifetv.com. And I see we've got about 30 plus people watching on lovinglifetv.com. If you're a guest there, please register. We have a daily broadcast email that goes out to a huge number of people who registered on our new platform. It's been going now for about 8 months, and we've been promoting it very strongly. And we've got a huge number of people. We send out emails every day which has updates on what's going on in South Africa, and includes videos put up by contributing channels, the forums, which are just going absolutely ballistic, and of course other videos that are put up by Loving Life. So it's a hugely popular new platform, and it will become South Africa's largest news and views online platform. That is our goal. That's where we're going. Okay, now I've got 3 final questions from people that I'm going to put to you, Dan, and then we'll start wrapping up. Michael Lawson has asked, does Dan believe that the investors will return with their businesses in Zululand? Do they have enough faith that it won't happen again?
I don't think so. You know, we saw the head office of Toyota. They wanted to pull out of the country. They were saying, you know, that they can't believe what's happening there, and that the harbor came to a standstill. So they wanted to simply, you know, drop everything and go. But then after a day or two, the Toyota South Africa put out a statement saying, no, you know, spoken to them, and we're aware of all the problems, and we can cope with them, and they committed to the country and so on. But I think, yes, I referred earlier on to the Detroit effect. I think we're going to see that in KwaZulu-Natal, and the province is going to become even more impoverished than it is already. And Durban's harbour, you know, in fact, you know, I'm subscribed to a newsletter from one of the courier companies. I mean, I used to use them, but they became so expensive that I started using another company. But I'm still getting the newsletters, and it's a huge company, one of the biggest ones in the country, and they've been hugely affected by this. By the riots, but over the last 2 days, we've had some sort of an IT problem, or they were hacked or something like that, of Transnet down in Durban, and the harbour, as a result of that, also came to a standstill.
Wow!
So you're running into all sorts of problems there in the Durban harbour. So I reckon that maybe Cape Town will pick up some of the slack, or you know, some of the other port cities in South Africa. I've always maintained that they could develop Mossel Bay as well as an alternative. So, yeah, I think KwaZulu-Natal is going to bleed as a result of this. They're not going to get investments. People would rather put their factories and their warehouses in some other spot than down there. And yeah, and already, you know, Ramaphosa said something to the effect that, okay, we also had riots in Gauteng, but not as bad as down in KZN. And he said something to the effect that 50% of the country's GDP is produced in the 2 provinces. But in fact, he neglected to mention that, you know, most of that is over here in Gauteng, that despite having probably the biggest population of any province, KZN only constitutes about 15 to 16% of the country's GDP. So, you know, yeah, it's not huge by any stretch of the imagination, and if it goes down a few points more, nobody would actually notice, except the people who live there.
Yeah,
they're going to become even more impoverished, and they're going to suffer from this, and they're already suffering. There's almost a famine there, and if it hadn't been for the very private sector listed companies that were looted, that actually then
the day.
put in. Saved the day. Yeah, they sent hundreds of trucks, huge trucks laden with food down there in order to prevent famine and hunger and so on. But if it hadn't been for that, they would have been in that situation already.
Right. Now, I've got a question here from Jan van Riebeck, and Jan van Riebeck is a good friend of the Lovey Life family, and it's interesting, whenever Ramaphosa has a go at Jan van Riebeck, we always sort of say, "Hey Jan, what you been up to?"
Oh yes.
But Jan has asked.
Yes, good old Jan.
Yeah.
Yes. I think I've been to his kind of birthplace in Holland, and the port that he sailed from.
Yeah,
as well.
This guy's real name is Shane, but he lives in the UK, but he's an expat South African. And anyway, he said, Scott, where does Dan see South Africa in 10 years' time? And I think that's a question on everybody's lips.
Yeah, it gets back to what I was saying. Now we predicting the future and some sort of a scenario. So one of the scenarios would be that this private sector just takes over, and the ANC becomes just a troupe of actors, and going through the motions of governing the country. But in fact, the center of power is no longer there. It's now in the hands of some form of private oligarchy. Maybe there's more. Yeah, or then also secession. I think the Western Cape could secede. There are already plans afoot there to generate their own energy down there and to become completely independent of Eskom. So, and there's a natural immigration to the Western Cape. A lot of people, I'm on this WhatsApp group for our matric class, and they've got these reunions every now and again. Our school is now 100 years old this year. And it just struck me how many of those people who actually were at school with me in Johannesburg are now living down in Cape Town or in the Western Cape. The people who have got the money, they just move down. And, who are not dependent on this sort of Gauteng economy, the Witwatersrand economy. Yeah, they're moving down there because it's just, things just work so much better down there. We were on holiday in the Southern Cape a few months back, and my youngest son said, well, it felt like another country. Completely, because things are clean and it's functioning, and you don't have this obvious degradation that you see around Johannesburg and Pretoria.
Yeah.
So yes, secession is definitely an option, I would say.
Well, certainly a better option than private companies running different parts of the country.
True.
Yes. Just on the secession side, I should just say that we've got the ULA, we've got Cape Exit Group. They're both sort of trying to get the mandates to get over the line to force a vote in the Western Cape.
Yes.
Then we got the Cape Party, which is actually wanting to be a political player so that they can get the balance of power to force the current DA government to actually put a referendum out there to the people of the Western Cape to see if they would like to secede from the rest of South Africa. Because clearly the DA at the moment are quite happy to be part of the bigger South Africa and don't want Western Cape to secede. But is there any comment you'd like to add to what I've just said?
Yes, the DA, it's kind of got this liberal past, or the Progressive Party, and then it became the Democratic Alliance and the DP, and then the Democratic Alliance. And secession is not naturally part of their ideological history. But in order to survive, they're going to have to make a change, I think, because if their voters want them to adopt those sorts of strategies, then they would just have to do it. And I think some of the things that they are doing down there are geared towards making the Western Cape more independent and more energy independent from the rest of South Africa. Also, sorting out their security and getting better policing. And then, naturally, after that, some form of autonomy should follow, because if you have more control over your health and your policing and your road system infrastructure and also electricity production, what's stopping you then from just becoming quasi-independent or autonomous or pushing for confederation? And they always say that confederation is just a step towards total independence.
Yeah, and of course the ANC will be in total chaos as things get worse and worse.
Yes, I mean, they wouldn't be able to stop it because, they couldn't even stop a few thousand looters. How on earth are they going to stop a few million people in the Western Cape from putting up a few border posts,
Same way.
I mean, if you've ever, one of the most interesting events in the early 90s, or sort of around about 89, 90, was the secession of Slovenia from the old Yugoslavia. And it happened within 10 days. There were 6 days of civil war, and after 10 days they were independent, and about 40 people died in the war. And I mean, if you think 40 people die in South Africa every day.
Yeah.
So, if people in the Western Cape really decide that they wanted it, I mean, they could have it tomorrow.
Yeah. Now, I've got one final question for you, Dan, and then I'm going to ask you to wrap up the live stream for me with a comment. Franz Marati has said, please ask Dr. Dan for his email address. Do you have an email address you're happy to give out?
Yes.
Who want to contact you?
It's dan@prague.org.
And that's praag.org.
That's it.
AA. Okay. All right. So Dan at Prague with AA .org. Dan@prague.org. All right, Dan, look, I'm going to wrap up the live stream. We've been going for 1 3/4 hours, and it's been a fascinating discussion. You're always a fantastic guest to have on Loving Life. Is there something you'd like to say in closing to people who are listening, perhaps a message of hope about South Africa, or what they should be concerned about? Maybe should they prep? Just over to you.
Yes, I think it is I know somebody, he's actually an academic who's written articles about so-called doomsday preppers and so on in the US and also in South Africa. But I mean, we're not really prepping for doomsday, but we have to be prepared, because we've seen that these sorts of events can overwhelm the country very quickly. So you have to keep some form of food reserves and also guns and ammunition and so on. And I think something that's going to happen now is that this new gun law is not going to fly, because it's obvious that we do need our own arms and guns, because the police won't be able to protect us. And there's going to be a whole debate about that, if Becky Shelley comes back with his new law where he wants to disarm everybody. So it's very important to be armed, be prepared for these eventualities. That's the one thing. And I think we also have to, combat all these leftist ideas in the mainstream media. I mean, it is being done on social media and on YouTube and online, but we have to be more assertive towards these kind of mainstream journalists and academics that they always put on after these sorts of events. I mean, I saw one so-called webinar where they had 5 or 6 of these people where there was, they were hopping on about inequality. That for them that explains everything. Inequality causes people to riot, and in order to stop the riots, we have to become more equal. We have to debunk those sorts of ideas, those sorts of simplistic ideas, and point people towards the complexity of our situation, the fact that South Africa is an ethnically very heterogeneous country, and we've got to come up with solutions for that. So that's very important. So we have to sustain this whole movement towards positive change in the country, and like-minded people will have to cooperate with one another. We shouldn't just everybody in our little corner and little bubble. Although now with this whole COVID thing, of course, people do tend to avoid contact with one another and gatherings and so on. But we can still cooperate, right. and that's very important. And in the past, we managed to cooperate very well. I think, in years gone by, people did cooperate socially and otherwise. We had one of the best armies in the world, and all of that can come back, I think, if we only find the ways of cooperating with one another.
Right. Now, I just want to remind everybody watching that tomorrow at 10:30 on Loving Life and on Loving Life TV, we will be going live to cover World Freedom Day protests in Cape Town, in Johannesburg, and in Durban. So we'll be having live coverage at all three major points where these protests are taking place from 10:30 tomorrow morning. That's South African time. Now, I had one final request here, Dan, and I'd like to hand this over to you. Someone has asked if you wouldn't mind saying a prayer for South Africa, just to wrap up the live stream.
Okay. Let's pray to God that He guards over us and gives us the strength to fight the good fight and to protect the diverse peoples inhabiting this land, and that He would grant us the peace and prosperity that we're all yearning for. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Dan. It's been an absolute pleasure having you tonight. And I look forward to our next live stream, maybe in a few months' time, where we get an update on what's going on in South Africa.
Yes, well, thank you very much for inviting me. And yes, I look forward to further discussions in the future.
Okay, fantastic.
Good night to everybody.
And don't forget my suggestion about the contributing channels, and hope to hear from you on that.
Definitely.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Take care. Bye for now.
Goodbye.
Okay, guys, that was Dan Roodt. Always a fantastic guest to have on. Very knowledgeable man. I just want to close by saying thank you to the moderators for looking after the side chat. And it's been too long, Jan van Riebeck. I've not seen you in the side chat. Great to see you back here. And please, guys, stay safe. And for everybody else who's watching, please have a great day. And don't forget, Saturday, 10:30 a.m., we're having a live stream covering the World Freedom Day in those locations I mentioned earlier. And don't forget, Sunday at 8 p.m. Johannesburg time, we're having a very, very special party for the Loving Life family. We're going to have all our channel heroes coming on live. We're going to have probably about between 15 to 20 guests joining us who've played a major role in how this Loving Life channel has grown and now has well over 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. And of course, please remember, if you're only on Loving Life on YouTube, to subscribe to our new platform, which is lovinglifetv.com, because that is where we are going to, and we're looking for contributing channels like Dan's to come and join us. We already have 20 channels, YouTube channels, which are participating on lovinglifetv.com. So when they put a video up, and they're all basically around South African news, when they put a video up, it goes up directly into our contributing channels. And of course, we have forums. Nat Quinn is doing a fantastic job with those. And Viking Boer, I see here, he does our daily bread on the forums, and they're always a really interesting and informative read. Alrighty, I've blabbered on enough. I'll leave the side chat open for a few minutes so you can say your goodbyes and have a bit of a chat. Hope to see you 10:30 tomorrow morning, South African time, while we cover the protests around the country. Cheers, guys. Bye for now.